All right, I want to welcome everyone to the Positive Youth Justice System webinar. For the folks on the West Coast, good morning, and everyone else, good afternoon. And we thank you all for joining us for this webinar. My name is David Muhammad, and I am the Executive Director of the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform. And again, we thank you all and welcome to this webinar. This webinar this morning is designed to highlight some of the principles of a report that we released a few months ago called A Positive Youth Justice System. It's an image of the report you can see there on your left. And the report really grew out of partially my own personal years of experience, a few decades working, running a nonprofit organization in Oakland, working with young people coming out of the juvenile justice system and working in facilities, about a decade as a correctional administrator in Washington, D.C., New York City, and in Alameda County, where Oakland is. And for the past 7 or 8 years, working with several jurisdictions throughout the country, many in California, and many around the country, helping to train staff, to write policy. I've served as the federal monitor of the Illinois Department of Juvenile Justice, and several other opportunities. And then there's a lot of research that went into this. Aman Sabatu at the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform, as well as our former colleague, Andy Gentile, did an enormous amount of research. And so that research and experience culminated in this report. In fact, an original version was written about 4 or 5 years ago, and we went to finish the report. We realized the field had advanced significantly in those 5 years. And we had to update many parts of the report, mainly to make bolder and stronger recommendations, because just in that small 5 years, the field had made tremendous progress, and our recommendations 5 years ago weren't as bold. And so, but mostly really looking at where the field has gone, is going, and still needs significant progress. So, I want again to thank and welcome you all. You should have access to the report. I know many people are on this webinar because they received the report and reviewed it. But for anyone on the webinar who has not had access to the report, you should have it there in your handouts. And I want to again thank everyone. We had tremendous response to the announcement of this webinar. We almost had to change portals to allow for larger access. And so we just really appreciate the response. The geographic diversity is pretty significant. We have people from across the country on with us today. And a little housekeeping. We are also recording this presentation, and we will make this available for folks afterward. And we will go through the 10 steps of developing a positive youth justice system. And we will talk about how the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform can support jurisdictions and advocacy organizations and everyone trying to improve and transform our juvenile justice system along the way. So I think I have filibustered long enough to get everybody signed on. And we want to jump into the presentation. You will see on your on the dashboard, which you should have on your right-hand side, the handouts, the ability to ask questions. And so if you have questions, please go ahead and type your questions into that dashboard. And again, we will answer some in the middle, and we will try to get to as many as possible, if not all, at the end of the presentation. So the premise of this whole work is that if we were starting from scratch, if we were creating a youth development system or a youth justice system with the intention of developing youth and supporting families and not doing harm and restoring victims and increasing public safety, if we were creating a new system from scratch, it is very unlikely that we would create a system similar to what we have today. And so when we imagine and envision creating a new system, it's very unlikely we would create one in which we have today. That being said, we have the system or sector or systems that we have today that we need to talk about transforming, while at the same time, we still need to keep in our minds, how could we create a brand new system that is on the basis of positive youth development? And somewhat as a side note, the National Institute for Criminal Justice is developing a pilot of an entirely new system that we'll talk about briefly. But today is primarily talking about taking the system that we have and trying to use it and transform it to be a system that is much better than what we have today. And so in 1899, when the first juvenile court was created in Illinois by Jane Addams and others, it really was designed to be a separate system from the adult criminal court that we had at that time, a system designed to meet the needs of young people and move away from just a pure punitive system. But unfortunately, very early on in this process of developing the system, we begin to mimic the very adult criminal punitive system that existed. And so today, overwhelming evidence shows that involvement in the juvenile justice system in and of itself produces negative outcomes for young people. This system has been moving in the right direction in the last few years, but how do we establish a juvenile justice system that reflects the original intentions of the juvenile court and provide the kind of support and guidance that our youth need and that our youth deserve? So numerous studies, and we highlight a number in the report, and we'll highlight just two quickly here. But numerous studies have found that involvement in the juvenile justice system alone, even while controlling for other factors like poverty and academic performance and neighborhood, but in system involvement in and of itself causes young people to have worse outcomes. So this one study that was rather large and rigorous looked at the effect of the juvenile justice system and found that incarcerating young people resulted in large decreases in the likelihood of high school completion and large increases in the likelihood of adult incarceration. Another study that really many of us in the field struggled with because it found that doing nothing with young people, and they used a very creative randomized control process, but it found that doing nothing with young people actually had better outcomes than engaging them in the justice system. One part of this study that I must say I personally struggled with showed that even when you supposedly try to positively engage youth within the justice system, they had worse outcomes than if you had done nothing with them. And so faced with this reality of challenging circumstances, it presses us to this notion of how do we transform this system? So building a positive youth justice system in summary is about reducing the size of the system, improving the quality of the system, and reinvesting the resources used on this large system back into communities and families and young people. So if we significantly reduce the size of and the number of youth in the system, thoroughly improve the conditions and services provided, and improve the outcomes of the small number of young people who remain in the system, and then use the hundreds of millions of dollars in savings from a massive reduction in the size of the system to reinvest in young people, their families, and the communities in which they live. This is the push for a positive youth justice system, smaller and better, and reinvest the enormous costs and resources into communities to help young people never come into the system in the first place. So we're going to go through this 10 step process, and the 10 steps in some way are sequential, but are more about here are 10 parts of the system that need reform, that need changing, and here's how we can do it. Again, there is more detail in the report itself. we're going to quickly highlight some of the challenges as well as some of the suggested reforms. We're going to move quickly through this because it's a lot of material to go over, and we are in the future going to have webinars specifically on parts of these 10 steps to go into more depth. But today's presentation is intended to have people be introduced to these concepts, as well as to engage a discussion around the notion of reform and transformation of our system in an overview. So number one, strive to keep youth out of the system altogether. Because of the fact that system involvement in and of itself causes young people to have negative outcomes, we should begin with this notion of let's have a goal to keep young people out of the system altogether. And so, for youth who have not been arrested for a serious or violent offense and who do not score high on a reliable risk assessment, then the default decision, the regular normal decision, should be to refer those young people to community services and support and not to detention or further adjudication. So to begin to close the front door of the system to as many youth as possible and have diversion and alternatives for a host of young people who would normally be coming into the system. Some steps to achieve this goal is to not touch any young people who've been assessed as low risk, to have non-system diversion options. So we have youth court, which has been successful. We have restorative justice in the last few years, some extremely successful examples of using restorative justice, not as an alternative, but as an entire diversion, so that young people are not still in the adjudication process at all, but they're diverted entirely out of the system. And this third, this NOAB, this Neighborhood Opportunity and Accountability Board, is this concept that the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform has been developing and are launching this year in a few jurisdictions. This idea that keep young people in the community and give the community the power, the ability, and the resources to address youth delinquency on its own. Then there are all alternatives. And so you might still be going through an adjudication process, but instead of being detained, you're in an evening reporting center, or you have been assigned to a community case manager, or you have a court notification system. Many young people have reported that they don't show up to court, not because they did not intend to, but they were not aware or forgot about the time and the date of their court. And court notification systems have proven to be very effective of getting young people and families to court. Step number two, collaborate with youth and families. So for those few young people who do come into the system because they have been assessed as being high risk and they have a serious case within the system, what we do with those young people should be in partnership with the youth and the families themselves. So we should develop case plans collaboratively with youth and family and share ownership of the plan. Young people and their families are the best experts in their lives and experiences. And when we develop case plans in a collaborative way, one, research has shown young people are much more likely to engage and comply with a plan when they've helped develop it themselves. I always jokingly say, if young people did exactly everything I told them, they would be successful. But unfortunately, young people are not apt to just do what I would say. But if we have a process where we're hearing from them, we understand their experiences, we hear from their family and their loved ones, and we develop a plan that will help them be successful, and they are the architects of that plan, it is far more likely that they will engage in that plan successfully. One quote from this study from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network that really gets at this point says, when families are viewed and treated as partners in both their child's care and in the operations of the juvenile justice system itself, the child, the family, and the system benefit. The most effective interventions for youth in the justice system are those that engage families in a strength-based partnership. And the whole notion of positive youth development is building on the strengths and the assets of young people, not simply focused on their deficits, and building on their strengths, which means we have to understand them, assess them, and build on their strengths and assets, focused on the positive. So to that point, focus on needs and strengths. For the far fewer youth who remain in the system, along with a risk assessment and a trauma screening and a needs assessment, and the risk assessment is becoming much more regular in the system. Trauma screening is increasing as we've had an increase in the trauma-informed sector in this work. Needs assessments are there. But what is missing from the vast majority of systems in the country is a strengths assessment and assets assessment, that we need to understand what's right with our young people and help them develop. This notion of a team approach, and it is much more prevalent in the child welfare system and is becoming a little bit of a practice in the youth justice system. But a team approach, when the young person, their family, and system staff who should be trained in positive youth development, who they sit down and develop a case plan, a life plan, an achievement plan for the young person, their family, to help determine what service, supports, and opportunities will the youth and family be connected to address their needs and build on their strengths. When I had the pleasure of being one of the deputy directors of the justice system in Washington, D.C., the youth justice system within the Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services, we launched this new approach called a youth and family team meeting, where every young person committed to our system, we held this youth family team meeting to determine what is going to happen with young people. And that meeting started off with a discussion on what is this young person's assets, and that's with the youth there, with their family or loved ones there. What's their assets and strengths? What is their needs and challenges? What service, supports, and opportunities can we connect them to build on their strengths and address their needs? A far different approach of dealing with young people than just seeing them as bundles of deficits that we need to fix or punish. So to that point, point number 3 is building on the strengths and addressing the needs. So our responses to young people are fundamentally different when we categorize them first by the ways that they are brilliant, resilient, and full of potential, rather than by some weaknesses and mistakes. And so this report by Georgetown University talked about juvenile justice agencies continue to employ correctional deficit-based approaches that rely heavily on imposing control over youth rather than promoting their development. And so these approaches are harmful and counterproductive, right? So if we see young people as simply bundles of deficits and we say, what did you do wrong? How do we punish you? Or how are you wrong and how we need to fix you? Rather than how are all the ways that you are right? And how can we build on your strengths and address your needs, is a much not only positive approach, but much more effective approach at helping young people succeed and not engage in delinquent behavior. So one of the big suggestions that we make in this approach of a positive youth justice system is to fundamentally change the job of a probation or parole officer or case manager, the case carrying staff in your justice agency, to redefine that job so that their main duties and responsibilities are to work with the youth on their caseload and their families, to identify their greatest needs and strengths, and to develop life plans or case plans or achievement plans, to connect those young people to service, supports, and opportunities to address those needs and build on those strengths. And so that the PO is being held accountable, that your number one duty is to work with the youth and family to develop this life plan and to connect that young person and their family to service, supports, and opportunities. So certainly getting away from your job is to drug test and to search the home. But even going beyond the new approach of to hand out a bunch of referrals, but to directly connect the young person to the services and supports that have been identified to build on their strengths and address their needs. This is this redefining of, and this means like rewriting the position descriptions, rewriting the performance evaluations, and holding the staff accountable to achieving these goals. This is one of the fundamental shifts that we need to make in our field. A progress toward that when I was in New York, and they continue to expand upon this and improve upon this, we developed this individual achievement plan as the goal and the duty of the probation officer, and identified certain domains that they had to see which are the greatest needs and strengths of the people on their caseloads, and connecting them to the services and supports that would address that identified domain in the achievement plan. And at the end of that plan, there was contract language that says the young person or person on the caseload, the probation officer, and the supervisor all agree to come together to resource this plan. 4, and we're going to go a little faster here, is to have the community take the lead. If one of our goals, as we'll see later, is to reduce and minimize probation, parole, the justice systems in time in a young person's life, as long as they're doing well. But we want them to have support for as long as possible. And so in order to achieve both of those goals, we suggest that the community take the lead in the direct engagement with the young person. So youth should be connected to meaningful and lasting relationships in their communities. To achieve this, community-based organizations, ideally run by and for members of that community, should be the primary providers of the direct services to youth in the system. And so this, again, moves the system into the role of quality assurance, providing contracts and resources to CBOs, of making sure there is a strong and lasting connection between community and the young people within the system. A few examples: in Washington, D.C., the Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services developed these regional service coalitions, also known as lead entities, where a portion of the justice agency's budget was given to 2 large nonprofits, and that they then subcontracted with a number of other CBOs in neighborhoods to provide services to young people in the system. We took that idea from Wayne County, Michigan, where Detroit is, where that system made a phased approach of having care entities or lead entities who led services, who second begin to phase out government probation officers, and had these community care entities contracted by probation to provide the direct services to youth in the community. I must acknowledge, and there's I have a good friend who's a colleague and friend of mine who reminded me that all jurisdictions don't have thriving, robust structure of community-based organizations, that there are many rural jurisdictions who may not be able to achieve this, having community-based organizations take the lead. And we do acknowledge that there's not a one-size-fits-all approach to this type of transformation. Next, don't lock youth up. In use of detention, we should, again, try to use it as sparingly as possible. But when it is used, the youth facility should be humane, free from abuse, heavily focused on education. So again, we want to close the front door as much as possible. But when detention is required, it should be for far fewer youth than there are today, even with the extreme reductions that we've experienced over the last several years. And when it is used, those facilities should be humane, free from abuse, and heavily focused on education. Young people should only be detained pre-trial for 2 reasons. And although this is in principle, much of this is codified in law in jurisdictions around the country. It's just often not used as much. But one, there is a legitimate and documented reason to believe that if released, the young person will not show up to court, although low-risk youth should never be detained. Two, evidence indicates that there are significant public safety risk issues. That evidence should not include, it should exclude the instant offense for which they are presumed innocent. And so there are very few young people who actually reach this threshold. And even with um, um, the significant progress we have made in the reduction in the number of young people who are detained. And all around the country, we have had a 60% reduction in juvenile incarceration, period. And a lot of that is in pre-adjudication detention. In California, for instance, there's been enormous reductions in detention. And although it's significant progress that should be celebrated, we can go even further by ensuring that young people who don't reach these two thresholds aren't detained. Steps to take. One, to use a reliable, fair detention risk assessment. And I'll just say we can have a whole nother webinar that is about detention risk assessment instruments or risk assessment instruments, period. Their challenges, their promises, the disparities that they sometimes create, the disparities they were created to solve. So that's why we're using the general term reliable risk assessment. But use a reliable, fair detention risk assessment. Do not detain any youth assessed as low risk, and do not detain most moderate risk youth. Develop an array of detention alternatives, and we've discussed many of them, like evening reporting centers that were very successful in Washington, D.C. and Santa Cruz, California, and community case managers. Reduce the time you spend in detention going through the adjudication process and awaiting placement. So for those few young people who are in detention while they're going through court, they should have, there's some jurisdictions that have actually passed speedy trial legislation that said young people will not spend more than 20 days or 25 days in detention going through the process. And hire expediters. A lot of young people stay in detention because of a bureaucratic process, because paper sits on people's desks. When I was in Washington, D.C., we hired a full-time expediter just really to be a thorn in the side of people to move paper. It had unbelievable progress. We went from nearly 30 days awaiting placement, just awaiting placement. This is after the adjudication process, awaiting placement times to 7 days, because we had somebody who was pushing the envelope on, let's make sure, as you see there on the bottom left, every day matters. Every day a young person is locked up, it has a profound effect upon them. And we can't have bureaucrats waiting and procrastinating while kids languish in detention. These are a few of the steps to take. And as I said, we will move forward to the next sections of the presentation. So step number 6 is keep the time of probation brief. Cap the length of supervision and probation to 10 months if youth have not had a violation or a new arrest. So research shows that longer lengths of probation result in unnecessary and harmful technical probation violations and incarceration when teens inevitably break the rules. And many of the long and onerous probation conditions that many people in probation are frustrated by themselves cause young people to, at some point along the way, break some sort of rule. And it's difficult for young people doing exceptionally well who've never had any type of delinquency case to follow 13 detailed rules of probation. The other thing is keeping youth on probation for longer periods contributes to higher caseloads, which tax probation officers and distract them from giving appropriate attention to higher risk young people, higher risk issues. And so the length of probation terms vary widely across the country. There's jurisdictions where you can come onto probation at 12 or 13 or 14 and stay on until you're 19. Other jurisdictions end supervision after 1 year, or they can end after a year if a judge ends it. And there's no rhyme or reason for why there's all these various lengths of supervision time. So probation supervision, which in many jurisdictions amounts to surveillance and searches and drug testing, really has proven to have negative effects on youth. And again, I'd say there's varying degrees of this around the country. I've been startled to see what this is like in many parts of the country where I've recently conducted trainings for probation officers and have been asked to write policies. And there's other places that are doing exceptionally well with trying to be a positive influence in people's life. And so the probation supervision should be cut to 10 months, both for the better outcomes as well as for preservation of the resources within the department. So the going from a trail 'em, nail 'em, and jail 'em approach to support and development. Now, many people in the probation industry, many of my friends and colleagues have felt that this is a demeaning way in which to describe probation, but this is an old historical way in which to describe probation and parole, community corrections, trail 'em, nail 'em, and jail 'em. And this comes from the history of really deficit punitive based approach to the justice system. And so we want to transform from there to this new approach. So keep supervision length to as short as necessary. Reduce the conditions of probation to only those that are directly tied to the youth's goals of rehabilitation and development. So we talked earlier around how all of these long 12, 13, 10 lists of onerous probation conditions that I've talked to many heads of probation who agree that they should be shortened, they should be reduced, but they really should be tied specifically to young people's goals of rehabilitation and development. Next, eliminate incarceration as a consequence for technical violations. This would really go a long way because so many juvenile detention centers are halfway full or mostly full with young people not there for a new offense, but there because they have violated some technical provision of their supervision. Juvenile justice systems should incentivize youth achievement. So give young people encouragement to achieve. Provide some sorts of incentive, which could be gift cards or movie tickets or all types of incentives that young people can be encouraged to do well. A young person on probation should also be able to earn time off of probation by achieving certain milestones, including significant academic improvement and high school graduation and program completion. One of the greatest encouragements to them would be to get time off of supervision. These measures would help reduce the caseload and workload of probation officers and parole officers and system staff and allow them to focus efforts and resources where they are most needed. Step 7, this out-of-home placement. Now, out-of-home placement, people within the system, we know it, but it's become a catch-all phrase to mean everything from placing young people in a single-family foster home to large privately run juvenile correctional facility. Out-of-home placement may sound nicer than incarceration, but it's often very similar. This is some of the headlines that we saw in Pennsylvania a few years ago for the Kids for Cash scandal, where judges were getting financial kickbacks for sending young people to privately run juvenile facilities. And these were, if you see the real well done documentary on this called Kids for Cash, young people with rather minor offenses being sent for long periods of time to private juvenile facilities with these judges receiving financial kickbacks. More recently, in the same state of Pennsylvania, we saw one of the Longest standing out-of-home placement residential facilities, Glen Mills, have a number of scandals and abuse that young people were receiving at the hands of staff. And even though it's in Pennsylvania, you had many counties from around the country, including California counties, sending young people 3,000 miles away to Glen Mills. And I've heard, and I hope that this is stopped now, but this practice of sending young people far away to out-of-home placements, many of which resemble juvenile facilities themselves, has proven to be not just young people experiencing abuse in some of the facilities, but even in facilities that may not have abuse, that we have poor outcomes similar to those when young people are incarcerated in state or county facilities. So jurisdictions should only use out-of-home placement in these two circumstances. If a youth has been assessed as high risk and is in need of treatment services that only a non-local residential setting can provide, or if a thorough and objective assessment finds that a youth's family home is not safe and no other family is willing or able to house the young person. Now, the second option is really a child welfare issue, but you have those child welfare issues creeping up for young people in the justice system. And these, again, if we limited out-of-home placement to young people only in this circumstance, then we would have far fewer youth in the system. A jurisdiction I worked in, we did an assessment of the young people in out-of-home placement after having reduced the number of youth in out-of-home placement, and we found that only 25% of youth currently in out-of-home placement reached this threshold, showing that we had a long way to go to further improve, reduce the work in our system. So out-of-home placement is usually very expensive, up to $150,000 a year, and far more for mental health facilities. In California, for young people in facilities, it's the current monthly cost is $9,400, and depending upon higher levels, it gets to $10,000. And there has been several reform efforts, not just in California, but around the country, to reduce the use of out-of-home placements and shorten the time young people stay. In the rare times that out-of-home placement is used, it should be for short periods of time, not more than 6 months, with rare exceptions, as an alternative to youth prison. And in those times, it should be in state. It should be as close to home as possible to engage families in the process, and they should be placed in therapeutic environments that have rigorous academic and enrichment programs. And far too many of our current out-of-home placement facilities don't reach this level. All right, 8, incarceration. As a result of a young person's court process, adjudication process, delinquent act. We should use incarceration very, very seldomly. Youth incarceration is ineffective, it's harmful, and it's excessively expensive. It does not work, it makes youth worse, and it costs a lot of money. If used, it should be sparingly and in facilities that are humane, with a focus on education, rehabilitation, and positive development. We're running late on time, but I do want to quickly say, several years ago, I was in a juvenile facility, and the local superintendent of schools was with me doing a tour. And I have to say, this is one of the better juvenile facilities that I had been in my career. And it was the first time she had ever been in a juvenile facility, and the majority of the youth in this facility had attended schools in her school district. And she had the appropriate response. And I remember being surprised, but it was appropriate. She was crying. And even though this was literally one of the better facilities I had seen, she understood that this was a jail. It was a youth prison. And it was more humane than most. It was cleaner than most. It had some positive staff, but it still physically was a jail. And it reminded me, I felt bad because we can become desensitized to the fact that these are children in concrete steel lockups. And it reminded me how every day matters, that we have got to do all we can to get young people out of such facilities in care, rehabilitation, treatment-oriented services and supports. So a new study by the San Francisco Chronicle found that California counties are spending upwards of $500,000 per year per bed in their juvenile halls. And so a national study by the Justice Policy Institute a few years ago showed that nationally the average cost, especially when you take California out of the equation because they push up the cost, about $149,000 per year per youth. But this recent study in the San Francisco Chronicle, which we have, this next is a slide or a graph that comes from that San Francisco Chronicle series that you see on the left, the bars showing the reduction in juvenile detention rates, and you see on the right the skyrocketing costs of detention, juvenile incarceration. You know, the irony is if you look at what they went up from, they're pretty expensive costs, but now approaching the $500,000 mark per year is excessive. And so what to do with all that resource? And so this one report from the Harvard Kennedy School and the National Institute of Justice, the federal government called for the closure of youth prisons. And I thought that this quote was a great summary. The call for the closure of youth prisons does not mean that there are not some young people for whom secure confinement is the right and necessary solution. But even for them, harsh, punitive, inhumane, and developmentally inappropriate settings are not the right place. Certainly not if the goal is, as it should be, positive youth development and rehabilitation. So developmentally appropriate services must be offered in facilities. And this is step 9 about when we have young people in facilities, what we do with them. So that should include trauma-informed therapy, cognitive behavior therapy, vocational training, life skills classes, recreation, and other enrichment programs. But high quality education should be the primary focus when a young person is incarcerated. And again, I can't give this caveat enough. The very few young people who reach the threshold of high risk and serious offense, then what we do with them as in need of a timeout from the community should be care, support, rehabilitation, treatment, education, not making them worse and treating them badly, and certainly not abusing them. So post-adjudication incarceration should only be used for youth who are assessed as high risk and have been adjudicated for a serious offense. And when that happens, there should be high quality education, rehabilitation and treatment services, positive development experiences, safe, humane, therapeutic environments. This image, or 2 images, on your left, you have the renowned Missouri model. On the right, you have a traditional juvenile facility. The Missouri model is not perfect, but it has been touted amongst the best of state juvenile facilities. In the 80s, they began to transform their facilities from the old large jail prison-like facilities to close to home and home-like. So you see there's bunk beds, wooden bunk beds and dressers versus the steel and concrete that we have in the vast majority of our facilities across the country. When I was in Washington, D.C., we had the opportunity to replicate this Missouri model. Again, not perfect, but we believe we were on the right track. And we took a budget that was for a 240-bed facility, and in its place, we built a 40-bed facility. So this is the image of the courtyard, an image inside one of the units. Very different than what we had, the old, horrible, decrepit, prison-like Oak Hill Youth Center, and turned it into this New Beginnings Youth Development Center. But we were wrong in the number of beds. I will admit, I thought we needed maybe 10 more than the 60 we built. That was wrong. Today, I think there's 20 juvenile adjudicated young people in this facility. And so we have continued to make progress, but we can do a lot better. Now, to the last step, reinvest. To reinvest when we shrink the system, when we reduce the system, and we see those tremendous costs that we spend currently on the system. But we should reinvest those funds back into the young people, their families, and the communities in which they come from. Even though the cost of juvenile justice systems is enormous, upwards of $6 billion per year, the majority of youth in the system come from poor families and poor neighborhoods. While government has been willing to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on a single youth to place them in harmful and ineffective facilities, the system has been unwilling to invest in those same young people, their families, and the communities. So, reinvestment. One, significantly more community-based services should be procured by government to be offered to youth and families who remain in the system. Next, a portion of savings generated from a reduced size youth justice system should be given to community foundations or non-law enforcement youth service government agencies to administer grants. So we hear a lot from people saying, well, especially, well-meaning, good people in the system who say, well, we want to do good. We want to spend on prevention. The positive justice system says the system should be focused on the few young people who we have to focus in order to make sure there is good public safety. But the spending in the system should certainly go to more prevention, developmental approaches for young people to help make sure they never reach the justice system. But that should not be administered by a law enforcement agency. And so there are great examples of this in Los Angeles, where they've done both. They've given money to foundations. They've also given money to the Office of Diversion and Reentry, a relatively new county government, and tens of millions of dollars have gone to these non-law enforcement agencies to provide services to youth and adults in the community. And it's a good example that can be significantly expanded. Investment directly into communities. And so this is one of the examples that has been done nowhere. Direct investment into communities hardest impacted by mass incarceration to improve the conditions of those neighborhoods and provide opportunities to those residents. Funding should go toward things like educational assistance to students and improvement of schools, employment training and job placement, down payment assistance for home purchase and rental assistance, neighborhood improvement like blight abatement and infrastructure development. Not the type of things we think about usually on justice spending, but the point being real community reinvestment to improve neighborhoods, to help so young people don't ever find themselves in the conditions and situations that lead to justice system involvement. This is genuine community investment, and community members should be helping to make those decisions. So to improve or reduce, improve, and reinvest. This was a great quote from a recent report from the Department of Justice, OJJDP, and published by the National Research Council that said, whether conducted in institutions or in communities, programs are more likely to have a positive impact when they focus on high-risk youth, connect sound risk needs assessments, I would add asset assessments, with the treatment approach taken, use a clearly specific program rooted in a theory of how adolescents change and tailored to the particular youth, demonstrate program integrity, involve young people's family, and take into account community context. That's a mouthful that really says focus the system on young people assessed as high risk, assess their risks and needs and assets, take a treatment and rehabilitation approach, be specifically focused on how young people change and develop, demonstrate program integrity, engage the family, and take into a community context. This is a positive youth development approach. And in the grand scheme of the system, reduce the size of the system, improve the quality of the system, and reinvest the savings of a reduced system back into the young people, their families, and the community. So how NICJR quickly can help jurisdictions achieve these goals. We conduct jurisdiction and agency assessments on where you are and what you have going on well and what can you improve upon. We are engaged in staff training on positive development. We've trained hundreds of staff around the country on PYD. Support in developing and writing new positive justice system policies and protocols. That's everything from youth and family team conferencing on how you develop these plans, supervision and case management standards or manuals, probation manuals, facility policies and operation manuals, helping to facilitate, coordinate stakeholder engagement. So helping to bring together various government agencies, community-based organizations, families, formerly incarcerated folks together to help develop the plans for a reform. Development of tools like response matrices. These are tools that help the system respond to youth behavior. When young people are doing well, how do you give them rewards and incentives? When young people are not doing what they're supposed to be doing, how do you have graduated responses and sanctions? A disposition matrix that takes into account young people's risk level and offense level and where they should fall upon how the system should respond. Case plans or life plans or achievement plans. All of these are tools that the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform can help jurisdictions develop. And then, of course, general technical assistance and implementation for support. So I've talked a lot in the last 50 minutes and appreciate your time and attention. I know we're getting close to the hour, and I want to make sure that we are answering questions that anyone has. We appreciate all of the people who have logged on. And I am going to just go in to a few of the questions. And so one, we were going to have, because of time, we're going to have Cheryl read them off, but I'll just jump into them. One question says, why 10 months? This is funny because I get this question a lot. Is there anything special about it? Why not 9 months? You're exactly right. There is no special 9 months, just like there's nothing special in the current 3 years or some jurisdictions that have 12 months. 10 months was taken, it wasn't just pulled out of the hat. It was taken to consideration time for a jurisdiction or an agency to work with that young person, their family, time to connect them to a series of supports and opportunities in the community, or in those rare cases where a young person does need to be in a facility, time to ensure that the rehabilitation treatment plan is developed and implemented. And so it is, I think, most important to say that it should be as much as needed, right? And so however much time is needed to connect young people to the services and supports that build on their strengths and address their needs, and how much time it's needed to maintain that connection. And it doesn't need to be finished, right? We just need to make sure they have a strong connection to the supports that they need in the community. And so based upon experience and looking at many jurisdictions, and we researched the length of time people spend on supervision, we landed on that 10 months. But you ask why not 9 months? That's correct. It could easily be 9 months. The big point here is not to for no reason just make it long periods of time. And there's many jurisdictions that have 12 months as the cutoff, but that requires going back before the judge and a judge to end supervision. And for some of those jurisdictions, they're just somewhat automatically renewed for another year. And so the books might say 1 year, but the experience is something else. And so I want to make sure a few things is to know that we are going to post the video of this webinar. It will be available for folks. We will email it out. I might need to ask Kate to jump in because there's far more questions than I just realized. And so,
hey, David, there's one other question.
Okay.
And this was also during step 6, keep any probation time short. The question is, could you talk more about community case management? What could that look like as an alternative to detention? Any jurisdictions using that currently?
Thank you. So the use of community case management can happen in in 2 different ways, really, as an alternative to detention specifically. And so this means a young person is charged with a delinquent offense. They're going to go through the adjudication process, but instead of being in a detention center, they're sent home. But one of the alternatives is not electronic monitoring, which I think is overly used and is used as a crutch, and there's no enrichment part of electronic monitoring. So this is a human being, a community case manager who checks on somebody frequently. So in Washington, D.C., we did this a lot. And we did this instead of electronic monitoring. So it was called intensive third-party supervision. And we contracted with community-based organizations. And when you were assigned to intensive third-party supervision, it was also called intensive third-party monitoring. That community case manager was tasked with seeing that young person at least twice a day, making sure they were home for their curfew, they were going to school, and that they were attending their court hearings. That had an enormous success. Young people, these are young people who scored high enough on the risk assessment to be detained, but were being given an alternative to go home, but assigned a community case manager. And so one, that's connecting them to a caring adult, which is significant, as well as using a much less expensive alternative than detention, with the idea that that case manager would develop a long-term relationship with that young person. But similar is true as a disposition, meaning a young person can be adjudicated for a delinquent offense and then assigned to a community organization. And this happens many places around the country. I must say Alameda County and Oakland has really expanded this recently as there has been an increase in juvenile justice funding throughout California, that several organizations receive funding to provide life coaching and case management to young people who've been placed on probation as a consequence of their delinquent case. And so the example can happen pre-adjudication as an alternative to detention, and it can happen post-adjudication as an assignment or outcome of your case. And I know we are beyond our time. I just want to say, Kate, is there one more question we can answer before we close, or have we done it?
We've answered all of the questions, so
great.
We've done it.
Let me thank everyone, and almost everyone who signed in has stayed on to this point. Thank you all for staying with us, and you will receive an email that has the recorded conference, so you can have this and share it and go back to it. It was a lot of information shared. So again, thank you all, and look forward to hearing more from us.